"The city will seize this land by the end of the month," the ruthless billionaire developer sneered, evicting me onto the freezing Seattle streets with nothing but a cardboard box. Victor Langdon thought he had destroyed my life to build his luxury lofts. He had no idea he had just forced me to retreat to my eccentric late uncle's abandoned forest cabin. As my trembling hands entered the final orbital mechanics calculation into the hidden Mosler Vault's keypad, the heavy steel door hissed open. Inside lay $4 million in bearer bonds and the original foundational trust deeds, proving Victor's entire real estate empire was built on stolen property. He thought he had buried me, but he just handed me the detonator to his complete destruction. The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it permeates. It finds its way into the seams of your coat, the soles of your shoes, and eventually the marrow of your bones. For Thomas Bradley, a 32-year-old freelance architectural drafter, the chill of a brutal November evening was amplified by the heavy cardboard box he was carrying out of the Arlington apartments in Belltown. Inside the box were the last remnants of a life he had spent 6 years building. A few framed photographs, a stack of hard drives, a French press, and a meager collection of winter clothes. Behind him, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung shut, guarded by 2 private security contractors, whose sheer presence ensured he wouldn't turn back. Thomas hadn't failed to pay his rent. He hadn't violated his lease. He was the victim of a ruthless legal loophole exploited by a man named Victor Langdon, the CEO of Langdon Property Holdings. Victor was a notorious figure in the Pacific Northwest real estate scene, known for acquiring older, rent-controlled buildings and aggressively pushing out long-term tenants to convert the spaces into luxury tech bro lofts. The Eviction was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. Langdon's firm had hired a shady structural engineering company to declare the building's plumbing and electrical systems an immediate hazard to human life. It was a fabricated crisis, but it was enough to trigger an emergency vacate order from the city. The tenants were given a mere 48 hours to leave. While a class action lawsuit was immediately drafted by the local tenants' union, justice in the court system moves at a glacial pace. Victor Langdon knew that by the time a judge looked at the falsified safety reports, the tenants would be scattered to the wind, out of money, and too exhausted to fight. Thomas, whose savings had recently been decimated by his mother's end-of-life medical care, was caught entirely off guard. He couldn't afford first, last, and a security deposit on a new Seattle apartment within 2 days. As he loaded his cardboard box into the trunk of his aging 2008 Honda Accord, his hands shook not just from the biting wind, but from a profound, boiling anger. He had done everything right. He had worked hard, paid his bills, and lived quietly. Yet, with the stroke of a billionaire's pen, he was rendered homeless. For the first 3 nights, Thomas lived in his car. He parked in the dimly lit corners of a 24-hour supermarket lot in Linwood, layering himself in 3 pairs of sweatpants and a sleeping bag he'd bought at a thrift store. Sleep was elusive. Every passing set of headlights felt like a police cruiser about to tap on his window. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. His phone battery hovered at 12%, a dying lifeline, connecting him to unanswered emails from potential clients and empty promises from legal aid clinics. On the 4th morning, as condensation dripped from the inside of his windshield, Thomas stared blankly at his steering wheel. He had exactly $74 to his name. The shelters were full, overflowing with the city's invisible casualties. He needed a roof, He needed a place where Victor Langdon's lawyers and the city's indifferent bureaucracy couldn't reach him. That was when the memory surfaced. It was a faint, hazy recollection from his childhood, a scent of cedarwood, pine needles, and old machine oil. Uncle Winston. Winston Gallagher was his late mother's eccentric older brother. He had been a master horologist, a creator and restorer of intricate antique clocks and mechanical oddities. In the late 1980s, Winston had a thriving workshop in downtown Portland, catering to wealthy European collectors. But after a violent break-in at his shop in 1994, Winston's paranoia skyrocketed. He liquidated his business, packed up his most secretive projects, and vanished into the dense, rain-soaked wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula. He had purchased a remote parcel of land on the northern edge of Lake Crescent, a glacially carved lake known for its terrifying depth and sapphire waters. There, Winston built a secluded A-frame cabin. Thomas had visited exactly twice as a child, remembering his uncle as a quiet, intense man, whose fingers were always stained with brass polish. Winston had passed away in 2018 of a sudden lower heart attack. Because he had no spouse or children, and because his will was a convoluted mess of riddles that infuriated the probate lawyers, the estate was frozen in bureaucratic limbo. The county eventually declared the cabin abandoned, assuming it was slowly rotting back into the damp earth of the Olympic National Forest. Thomas pulled out his phone, 7% battery. He opened a satellite map app and traced the winding curves of Highway 101. If the cabin was still standing, and if he could find the unmarked dirt access road he barely remembered, he would have shelter. It was technically trespassing, but it was family land. More importantly, it had walls, a roof, and a wood-burning stove. He started the Honda's engine, the fuel light glaring an angry yellow on the dashboard. He spent $40 on gas, $30 on non-perishable canned goods, and drove west toward the Olympic Peninsula, leaving the cruel, towering cranes of Victor Langdon's Seattle behind him in the rearview mirror. The drive was treacherous. As Thomas skirted the edge of the Olympic National Park, a violent Pacific storm rolled in. The rain lashed against his windshield in horizontal sheets, and the towering Douglas firs swayed menacingly in the gale. The two-lane highway hugging the shoreline of Lake Crescent was slick and narrow. The lake itself looked like an abyss of churning black water on his right. It took him 4 hours of agonizingly slow driving to find the landmark his mother had once described. An old, rust-eaten logging chain wrapped around a massive, lightning-struck cedar stump. Beside it, barely visible through the thick ferns and salal bushes, was a rutted dirt track leading straight up into the dense timberline. Thomas parked his Honda off the shoulder, camouflaging it as best he could behind a thicket of blackberry brambles. He packed his belongings into a duffel bag, grabbed a cheap LED flashlight, and began the hike. The woods were suffocatingly dark, the canopy so thick it blocked out whatever twilight remained. The trail was choked with fallen branches and slick moss. After an hour of exhausting, lung-burning climbing, the trees suddenly parted. There, silhouetted against the dark sky, was the cabin. It was larger than he remembered. A stark, steep-pitched A-frame structure built from heavy timber and river stone. It looked what and feral, as if the forest had tried to swallow it whole, but failed. Ivy climbed the stone chimney, and moss blanketed the cedar shingles, but the structure was miraculously intact. Thomas approached the heavy oak front door. He fully expected it to be padlocked or barricaded. To his surprise, the brass handle turned with a heavy, satisfying click. It wasn't locked. Winston, in his deep paranoia, had apparently felt no need to lock his doors in a place he believed no one could ever find. Thomas pushed the door open. The air inside was freezing, but it was bone dry. He clicked on his flashlight, letting the beam cut through the absolute darkness. The interior was a literal time capsule. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, settling over mid-century modern furniture covered in faded white dropcloths. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with leather-bound volumes on engineering, history, and mechanics. In the center of the great room sat a beautiful circular cast-iron wood stove. To Thomas's immense relief, stacked neatly against the stone hearth was a massive cord of seasoned dry firewood. Winston had prepared for a winter that he hadn't lived to see. It took Thomas 20 minutes to get a fire going, his hands trembling so violently from the cold that he could barely strike the matches. When the kindling finally caught, the flames casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the dusty cabin, Thomas slumped against the stone hearth and wept. It was a release of all the stress, the humiliation of the eviction, and the sheer terror of the past 4 days. For the first time in a week, he felt safe. Over the next few days, Thomas fell into a quiet rhythm of survival. He melted snow for drinking water, rationed his canned chili and beans, and spent his daylight hours fortifying the cabin. He patched the small leak in the roof, cleared the brush away from the windows, and explored his uncle's isolated domain. The cabin was a testament to a brilliant, obsessive mind. The main floor consisted of the living area, a small kitchen, and a bathroom hooked up to a gravity-fed well system that still worked. The loft upstairs was a bedroom overlooking the trees, but it was the back room on the ground floor, Winston's workshop, that drew Thomas's attention. The workshop was a chaotic museum of gears, springs, brass casings, and drafting tools. Heavy oak workbenches were covered in magnifying glasses, precision screwdrivers, and half-finished clock faces. It was fascinating, but as Thomas spent more time in the room, his architectural background kicked in. His brain was trained to see spatial relationships, volume, and dimensions. On his 5th day at the cabin, Thomas stood in the center of the workshop, frowning. He paced the length of the room, counting his steps. Then he went outside into the freezing cold and paced the exterior wall of the cabin. He did it 3 times. The math didn't make sense. The interior length of the workshop was 14 feet. The exterior wall measured exactly 19 feet. There was a discrepancy of 5 solid feet of space that simply didn't exist on the inside. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He rushed back inside and began a meticulous examination of the workshop's back wall. It was paneled in beautiful, seamless, vertical cedar planks. There were no handles, no hinges, and no visible seams. He ran his hands over the wood, pressing, tapping, listening for a hollow sound. Nothing. For hours he scoured the room looking for a switch, a hidden button under a desk, or a loose floorboard. His frustration mounted. He was about to give up, assuming the extra space was just a heavily insulated utility void for the plumbing, when his eyes landed on a peculiar object sitting on a dusty side table. It was a heavy, ornate metronome, the kind musicians use to keep time. It was made of polished mahogany, but instead of the standard sliding weight on the pendulum, It had a heavy brass gear. It was out of place in a room dedicated to clocks. Thomas walked over and picked it up. It was incredibly heavy, bolted down to a square base. He noticed a small, beautifully engraved brass plate on the base that read, "Tempo rubato, stolen time." Driven by pure instinct, Thomas reached out and pulled the pendulum all the way to the right. Instead of swinging back, the pendulum locked into place with a sharp mechanical times clack. Suddenly, a deep, resonant hum echoed through the floorboards. It sounded like heavy gears grinding to life after a decade of slumber. From behind the cedar-paneled wall, a rush of stale air hissed out. With a groan of shifting weight, a massive section of the bookcase and the wall itself smoothly swung inward, revealing a pitch-black void. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and stepped through the threshold. He found himself in a small, windowless room constructed entirely of poured concrete, a veritable bunker hidden within the wooden cabin. The air here was perfectly climate-controlled, lacking the damp chill of the main house. In the exact center of the room, sitting beneath a single dangling light bulb, was a safe. But this was not an ordinary floor safe. It was a monstrous antique Mosler bank vault, standing 5 feet tall and painted a deep, lustrous forest green with gold leaf pin striping. It had to weigh over 3,000 pounds. The door was dominated by a massive brass dial and a heavy spoked wheel. Thomas stepped closer, shining his light over the cold steel. The combination dial was unlike anything he had ever seen. Instead of numbers, the dial was engraved with astrological symbols, Roman numerals, and tiny, intricate mechanical gears that interlocked with the main tumblers. It wasn't just a lock, it was a complex mechanical puzzle. Resting on top of the safe was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. The wax was stamped with a deeply embossed hourglass crest. With trembling fingers, Thomas broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper. The handwriting was elegant, written in sharp black fountain pen ink. To the one desperate enough to return, if you are reading this, it means you have remembered this place. It means the world below has failed you, just as it failed me. I spent my life building timepieces for men who only cared about money, completely blind to the fact that time is the only true currency we possess. Inside this vault lies the culmination of my life's work. It is an inheritance, a weapon, and an equalizer. It is worth more than the land, the house, and the city you left behind. But I do not reward the lazy, and I do not tolerate the foolish. There are 3 mechanical locks. Brutal force will trigger a glass vial incendiary charge within the door, reducing the contents to ash. To open it, you must prove you have the patience to understand time. Your first clue, look to the man who stole fire from the gods, but count the days he was bound to the rock. Do not fail. G. Thomas stared at the letter, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the intimidating, impenetrable beast of a safe. He was an architect, not a code breaker. He was a man who had lost everything to Victor Langdon's greed, currently living off canned beans in a forgotten forest. But as he looked at the intricate dials, a spark of fierce, unyielding determination ignited in his chest. He had nothing left to lose, and an empire locked behind 3 inches of steel right in front of him. The game had just begun. The sheer size of the Mosler vault was intimidating enough, but the complex mechanism of the dial was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Thomas ran his hand over the cold, gold-leafed steel. He was freezing, exhausted, and running on a diet of canned beans. But his mind had never been sharper. Adrenaline is a powerful fuel. He retreated to the main cabin, grabbing the lantern, and began scouring his uncle's extensive library. Winston's clue was a riddle steeped in mythology. But Winston was a man of science, precision, and mathematics. Is greater than look to the man who stole fire from the gods. But count the days he was bound to the rock. Prometheus, Thomas whispered, trailing his fingers over the dusty spines of encyclopedias. In Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire and gave it to humanity. As punishment, Zeus chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where an eagle ate his liver every day. Thomas pulled a battered volume of Aeschylus's Times Prometheus Bound Times from the shelf. He flipped through the translated pages, looking for a number. According to the ancient texts, Prometheus was bound to the rock for 30,000 years. Thomas did the quick math in his head. 30,000 years multiplied by the days in a year would be a number far too massive for a combination dial. He needed a different angle. Winston was a clockmaker, an astronomer of gears. Thomas shifted his gaze to the science section and pulled down a heavy leather-bound textbook titled Time Celestial Mechanics and Orbital Dynamics. He flipped to the index and searched for Prometheus. There it was. Saturn the 16th, the inner satellite of Saturn, discovered in 1980. It acts as a shepherd moon for the inner edge of Saturn's F-ring. Thomas's heart raced as he read the entry. He needed to find a specific time measurement, the days he was bound to the rock, or in this case, the rings of Saturn. The book listed the moon's exact orbital period, calculated using Kepler's third law of planetary motion. Winston had written a note in the margin, detailing the formula for the orbital period TEPSO-KUREFRAKAUGM, where A is the semi-major axis, G is the gravitational constant, and M is the mass of Saturn. Thomas looked at the final calculated value in his uncle's meticulous handwriting. The orbital period of Prometheus was exactly 0.61299 days. He rushed back into the concrete bunker. He grasped the heavy brass dial. It didn't have standard numbers. It had hash marks denoting decimals. Carefully holding his breath, Thomas rotated the dial, right aligning the indicator with the hash marks, representing 61,299. A loud, heavy times, thunk times, echoed from deep within the 3-inch steel door. The first tumbler had dropped, but the door didn't open. The dial locked, and a small secondary brass drawer popped open at the base of the safe. Inside the drawer sat a solid cylinder of polished brass, a pair of digital calipers, and a second note written on parchment. Time is heavy, Thomas. If you cannot balance the weight of your actions, the fire will consume the rest. Calculate the exact moment of inertia of this brass weight, rotating about its central axis. Enter the value on the secondary keypad. Next to the drawer, a tiny numerical keypad, completely hidden until now, glowed with a faint red LED light. Thomas picked up the brass cylinder. It was incredibly heavy. He knew from his architectural engineering classes that a wrong answer here might trigger the incendiary device Winston warned about. He took the cylinder and the calipers back to the workbench. First, he measured the mass, $M, using Winston's precision apothecary scale, exactly 4.5 kilograms. Next, he used the calipers to measure the radius, $R, of the cylinder, exactly 0.08 meters. He grabbed a piece of drafting paper and a pencil. The formula for the moment of inertia, $Y, $I, of a solid cylinder rotating about its central axis, was fundamental mechanics. E frac uno doi, Mr. Doi. He plugged in the values carefully. E frac uno, doi, 4,5, 0,0, oct. Doi, e dos punto, dos cinque times, 0.006 e null, at fira, text, key, C text M2. Thomas stared at the number, 0.0144. It was a precise, undeniable mathematical truth. He walked back into the bunker. His hand hid shaking as he hovered over the secondary keypad. If his measurements were off by even a millimeter, or if the scale was improperly calibrated, the contents of the vault would burn. He punched in the digits, 0 to 0 minus 1 to 4 minus 4, and pressed the brass times enter times key. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The silence in the concrete room was deafening. Then a hiss of pressurized air released from the door seals. A series of heavy locking bolts retracted with a deafening metallic times clang. The massive spoked wheel on the front of the Mosler vault turned on its own, spinning freely. Thomas grabbed the wheel and pulled. With the smooth, frictionless glide of perfect engineering, the 3,000-pound steel door swung open. The inside of the vault smelled of dry cedar and old paper. There were no stacks of gold bullion or piles of $100 bills. Instead, the vault contained 3 specific items, meticulously arranged on velvet-lined shelves. Item 1, a stack of original unregistered bearer bonds issued in the 1980s. Thomas quickly flipped through them. Their face value totaled over $4 million. Item 2, a heavy steel-cased hard drive, completely protected from electromagnetic degradation. Item 3, a thick leather binder embossed with the seal of the King County Superior Court. Thomas pulled the binder from the safe and opened it under the harsh glow of his flashlight. As he began to read the documents, his breath caught in his throat. The cold of the bunker entirely vanished, replaced by a searing, white-hot vindication. Winston Gallagher wasn't just a paranoid clockmaker. In the early 1990s, Winston had been the silent financial backer for a massive real estate trust in Seattle. His partner in the venture was a young, cutthroat property manager who had systematically falsified structural reports, forged signatures, and illegally transferred the trust's foundational assets into his own shell corporation. That young property manager was Victor Langdon. The 1994 break-in at Winston's Portland shop hadn't been a random robbery. It was Victor's thugs looking for the original foundational trust deeds that proved his entire real estate empire, including the Arlington apartments, was built on stolen property. Winston had managed to hide the deeds, but the trauma drove him into hiding. He spent the rest of his life compiling an ironclad, undeniable paper trail of Victor Langdon's fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. Winston had designed the ultimate time bomb. He just needed someone desperate and smart enough to detonate it. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He packed the binder, the hard drive, and a handful of the bearer bonds into his duffel bag. At first light, he locked the heavy oak door of the cabin, hiked back down through the freezing rain to his Honda Accord, and drove straight back to Seattle. He didn't go to legal aid. He didn't go to the tenants' union. He went straight to the sleek, glass-paneled downtown offices of Times Davis Wright Tremaine, one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigation firms in the Pacific Northwest. Walking into the high-end lobby in his unwashed thrift store sweatpants, Thomas drew disgusted looks from the security guards. But when he slapped a $100,000 bearer bond onto the mahogany reception desk and demanded to see a senior equity partner regarding a multi-million-dollar property reclamation, the doors opened immediately. What followed was the most aggressive corporate bloodbath Seattle had seen in a decade. The evidence Winston had meticulously gathered was flawless. The hard drive contained audio recordings, original forged blueprints, and undeniable proof that the recent emergency condemnations of buildings like the Arlington Apartments were entirely fabricated. Within 72 hours, the FBI raided Victor Langdon's corporate headquarters in Pioneer Square. The King County Superior Court placed an immediate freeze on all of Langdon Property Holdings' assets. Because Victor's initial acquisition of the properties was proven to be fundamentally fraudulent, the ownership of the Arlington Apartments and a dozen other historic buildings reverted back to the original trust. As Winston's sole heir, Thomas Bradley became the controlling director of that trust. Victor Langdon, the man who had ordered Thomas thrown onto the freezing streets with nothing but a cardboard box, was arrested on 42 counts of federal fraud and racketeering. He was denied bail. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the newly renovated lobby of the Arlington Apartments. He hadn't turned it into tech bro lofts. Instead, he legally converted the building into an affordable housing cooperative, guaranteeing that no tenant could ever be unjustly evicted again. He paid off his mother's remaining medical debts, fully restored his uncle's cabin on Lake Crescent, and moved his drafting studio there permanently. The woods were no longer a desperate refuge. They were home. The Mosler vault in the hidden concrete bunker remained open, now serving as a secure place for Thomas's own architectural designs. Uncle Winston was right. Time is the only true currency we possess. Victor Langdon had tried to steal Thomas's time, but in the end, the clockmaker had the final say. Did this incredible story of ultimate revenge and hidden treasure keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching a ruthless billionaire get taken down by a brilliant puzzle, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a perfect plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life mysteries and thrilling stories every single week.